I spent years inside the intelligence system watching how language quietly replaces strategy, and nothing illustrates that decay better than the casual use of the phrase red line. When I hear a president warn that Iran is starting to cross a red line, my first instinct is not alarm but skepticism. In intelligence work, a real red line is not rhetorical. It is defined by observable indicators, validated thresholds, and pre approved response pathways. What I see instead is a phrase deployed for television, not for decision making, untethered from any publicly articulated intelligence criteria that would explain what crossing that line actually means. The protests in Iran did not suddenly materialize out of nowhere. Internal unrest has been a recurring feature of the Islamic Republic for decades, and every serious intelligence service knows that protest activity alone is not a reliable indicator of regime collapse or imminent strategic change. Yet the public narrative immediately jumped from unrest to moral outrage to implied U.S. action without any transparent explanation of what intelligence collection confirmed, what remained unverified, or what assumptions were driving policy pressure. That is how intelligence becomes fiction, when conclusions appear before the evidence is fully weighed. When casualty figures are cited, hundreds killed, internet blackouts imposed, those claims may ultimately be accurate, but accuracy is not the same as analytic rigor. Intelligence professionals are trained to distinguish between reporting, confirmation, and assessment. Public statements that skip those steps signal something dangerous. Policy is already moving, and intelligence is being dragged behind it to provide justification. Once a president publicly invokes a red line, the intelligence community is no longer asking what is happening, it is scrambling to explain why action might now be necessary. I have seen this pattern before. Red lines were invoked in Syria, in Ukraine, in countless crises where enforcement was ambiguous or non-existent. Each time adversaries learned the same lesson. American red lines are elastic, negotiable, and often symbolic. When a leader says a line is starting to be crossed, it suggests uncertainty, not resolve. Intelligence assessments do not operate in that gray rhetorical space. Either thresholds are met or they are not. The deeper problem is not Iran, it is the normalization of narrative-driven signaling as a substitute for strategy. When warnings are issued without defined triggers or consequences, they degrade deterrence rather than strengthen it. Adversaries test, probe, and adapt, while allies quietly adjust their expectations downward. That is how credibility erodes, not through one dramatic failure, but through repeated moments where intelligence discipline gives way to public theater. One of the most corrosive developments I witnessed over the years was the steady erosion of analytic discipline when emotionally charged events entered the media bloodstream. Protests are a perfect example. Once unrest is framed as a moral crisis rather than an intelligence problem, the pressure to confirm the worst assumptions becomes overwhelming. In the case of Iran, reports of mass demonstrations, hundreds of deaths, and nationwide internet blackouts immediately hardened into accepted truth in the public narrative, even as basic intelligence questions remained unresolved. Who was reporting the numbers? How were casualties verified? What portions of the country were actually involved? And at what scale? Those questions matter because policy built on unverified assumptions is not policy at all, it is improvisation. I am not suggesting that repression did not occur. The Iranian state has a long record of violent crackdowns, and no serious analyst doubts its willingness to use force. But intelligence work is not about what we believe a regime is capable of doing. It is about what we can confirm with confidence at a given moment. When casualty figures are cited without transparent sourcing, they function less as analytic inputs and more as emotional accelerants. They shape headlines, trigger political outrage, and narrow decision space before intelligence assessments have time to mature. The fog thickens further when communication blackouts are introduced into the narrative. Internet shutdowns are presented as proof of regime panic and imminent collapse, yet intelligence history tells a more complicated story. Authoritarian governments frequently restrict connectivity not because they are losing control, but because they are consolidating it. A blackout does not automatically indicate weakness. It can just as easily signal preparation, compartmentalization, and counterintelligence discipline. Treating it as evidence of desperation reflects narrative bias, not analytic clarity. What concerns me most is how quickly these elements are fused together into a single storyline. Brave protesters, mass killings, a terrified regime, and a moral obligation for the United States to act. Once that storyline solidifies, intelligence assessments are quietly repurposed to support it. Analysts are asked to estimate how many were killed, not whether the numbers are reliable. They are tasked with assessing regime vulnerability, not regime resilience. The question shifts from what is happening to how do we respond before the first question has been adequately answered. This is how intelligence failure is manufactured in real time, not through fabricated reports, but through selective emphasis and premature certainty. When leaders speak publicly about red lines amid unfolding protests, they lock themselves into narratives that intelligence may not be able to support. At that point, facts become obstacles rather than guides. The fog of narrative replaces the discipline of assessment, and policy drifts further away from reality. By the time a crisis reaches the stage where a president is publicly discussing upcoming briefings, the most important decisions are usually already made. I learned early in my career that formal briefings are often less about informing leaders than about creating a record that intelligence supported the path chosen. In the Iran case, the announcement that the president would be briefed on options, sanctions, cyber operations, even military strikes followed a familiar script. The menu was presented as if it were open, when in reality, the boundaries of acceptable action had already been defined by political signaling and public rhetoric. Intelligence briefings, at their best, are meant to constrain impulse. They are supposed to clarify uncertainty, outline risks, and expose unintended consequences. But when briefings are framed for public consumption, they become performative. The presence of senior officials, the leak of agenda items, and the media anticipation all serve a narrative function. They signal seriousness without committing to outcomes. From an intelligence perspective, this is dangerous. It creates the illusion of deliberation while compressing real analytic debate behind closed doors. I have watched analysts struggle in these moments. They are asked to provide assessments of sanctions efficacy, cyber impact, and military feasibility under severe time pressure, often with incomplete data. Worse, they are implicitly guided toward conclusions that align with existing political statements. If the president has already warned of red lines and strong options, intelligence is expected to justify why those options make sense, not whether they should be pursued at all. Dissenting assessments are quietly softened, caveats buried, and uncertainties reframed as manageable risks. Sanctions, in particular, are habitually oversold in these briefings. Intelligence agencies are asked to project economic pain, internal dissent, and regime pressure, even when historical evidence shows diminishing returns. Cyber operations are described as precise, deniable, and controllable, despite repeated examples of blowback and escalation. Military strikes are framed as limited and symbolic, as if adversaries have never responded asymmetrically. Each option is presented as cleaner and more effective than reality suggests. The theater of briefing also serves another function. It buys time. By announcing deliberation, leaders delay accountability while maintaining narrative momentum, yet adversaries are not fooled. They understand that leaked briefings often mask indecision or internal disagreement. When intelligence becomes part of this performance, its credibility erodes. Assessments are no longer seen as neutral evaluations of reality, but as instruments of narrative management. This is the structural failure at the heart of America's strategic decline. Intelligence is no longer the foundation of policy, it is the stage set behind it. Once that inversion occurs, mistakes are not corrected, they are rationalized. And each crisis reinforces the lesson that intelligence exists to serve power, not to restrain it. If there is one theme that dominates modern U.S. crisis response, it is the belief that we can exert pressure without paying a price. Cyber operations and sanctions have become the preferred tools because they promise influence without blood, action without escalation, and control without commitment. From an intelligence standpoint, that belief is dangerously overstated. I have watched these tools migrate from supplemental measures to default responses, not because they work reliably, but because they are politically convenient and analytically easy to sell. Sanctions are routinely presented as precise instruments capable of targeting regimes while sparing populations. The intelligence reality is far less tidy. Economic pressure rarely produces linear political outcomes. It hardens elites, empowers security services, and incentivizes black markets. In Iran's case, decades of sanctions have not produced regime collapse or strategic capitulation. They have produced an adaptation. Yet, in briefing rooms, analysts are still asked to estimate how additional sanctions will increase pressure, as if pressure automatically translates into compliance. That assumption substitutes repetition for analysis. Cyber operations suffer from a similar mythology. They are described as reversible, deniable, and escalatory only on our terms. Intelligence professionals know better. Cyber actions are detected more often than publicly acknowledged, and attribution is rarely as ambiguous as policymakers hope. Once cyber operations cross certain thresholds, they invite retaliation, sometimes in domains we did not anticipate. The idea that cyber tools can be used as a safe signaling mechanism reflects a misunderstanding of adversary capabilities and tolerance for risk. What concerns me most is how intelligence assessments are bent to preserve the illusion of control. Analysts emphasize tactical success systems disrupted, networks degraded, while strategic consequences are downplayed. Questions about regime learning, countermeasures, and long-term escalation are treated as secondary. The focus remains on what we can do, not on what happens after we do it. That is not intelligence realism, it is bureaucratic optimism. In the Iranian context, the reliance on sanctions and cyber tools allows leaders to appear decisive while avoiding the hard choices associated with overt force or diplomatic concessions. But adversaries are not passive. They study our patterns. They understand that sanctions signal reluctance, not resolve, and that cyber actions often precede, rather than replace, broader confrontation. Each time we lean on these tools as substitutes for strategy, we teach our opponents how to absorb and neutralize them. The illusion of control is comforting, but it is false. Power exercised without a clear theory of change is not power at all, it is motion. Intelligence was meant to expose that distinction. Instead, it is now often used to conceal it, dressing familiar tools in fresh language while repeating the same strategic errors. Every generation of policymakers seems to rediscover the idea that information access can substitute for political power. In my time, it was leaflets and radio broadcasts. Today, it is satellite internet and social media platforms. The assumption is always the same. If people can communicate freely, authoritarian systems will fracture from within. From an intelligence perspective, this belief consistently ignores how modern regimes actually function. Technology does not exist in a vacuum. It operates inside an adversarial environment shaped by counterintelligence, surveillance, and coercion. The discussion around expanding satellite connectivity into Iran reflects this recurring fantasy. The narrative suggests that providing protesters with communication tools will shift the balance of power. What that overlooks is the regime's long experience with internal dissent and external interference. Iranian security services are not improvising. They are structured, adaptive, and supported by foreign partners who have spent years studying the same technologies the United States now treats as game changers. Intelligence reporting has long shown that authoritarian regimes learn quickly, especially when their survival is at stake. From an analytic standpoint, information warfare is one of the most misunderstood domains. Access to communication does not automatically translate into coordination, leadership, or strategic coherence. Protests require organization, protection, and logistical sustainment, none of which are solved by connectivity alone. Worse, external support for information tools can expose participants to identification and targeting. When intelligence professionals raise these concerns, they are often dismissed as overly cautious or insufficiently supportive of democratic movements. That dismissal is not moral clarity, it is analytic negligence. What makes the Starlink narrative particularly revealing is how it shifts responsibility. If unrest fails to achieve political change, the failure is attributed to insufficient bandwidth or delayed deployment, not to flawed assumptions about power and control. Intelligence assessments are then pressured to validate the next technological fix. This cycle repeats because it offers hope without demanding strategic commitment. It allows leaders to claim action while avoiding accountability for outcomes. There is also a bigger risk that rarely makes it into public discussion. Information operations are not cost-free signals. They are perceived by adversaries as acts of interference. When connectivity tools are framed as instruments of regime destabilization, they invite countermeasures that extend beyond the digital domain. Intelligence professionals understand that escalation does not always follow our preferred script. Actions intended as support can be interpreted as provocation, tightening, repression rather than loosening it. The fantasy persists because it is emotionally appealing. It aligns with the belief that technology favors openness and that control is brittle. Intelligence history teaches a harsher lesson. Control adapts, power responds. When information warfare is treated as a shortcut to political change, it becomes another example of narrative optimism replacing strategic realism. Whenever talk turns to military options, especially against a force like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, I recognize a familiar danger. Militarized signaling is often mistaken for strategy. Naming targets, floating strike options, and invoking precision capabilities create an impression of control and seriousness, but from an intelligence standpoint, they frequently obscure more than they clarify. The IRGC is not a discrete battlefield formation. It is embedded across Iran's security, economic, and political systems. Treating it as a clean military target reflects a conceptual misunderstanding that intelligence assessments have failed to correct. I have watched policymakers gravitate toward IRGC targeting because it appears limited and morally defensible. The logic is seductive. Hit the regime's coercive arm, avoid civilian harm, send a message. What that logic ignores is how such actions are perceived inside Iran and across the region. Intelligence reporting has repeatedly shown that external military pressure, especially when framed as punishment, tends to consolidate elite cohesion rather than fracture it. Strikes meant to signal resolve often strengthen the very structures they aim to weaken. There is also a chronic failure to think beyond the initial action. Intelligence assessments routinely focus on immediate tactical outcomes, facilities damaged, personnel killed, capabilities degraded, while strategic consequences are treated as speculative footnotes. In reality, adversaries plan their responses in advance. The IRGC's value to the regime lies not only in what it does internally, but in its capacity to retaliate asymmetrically. Proxy networks, maritime disruptions, cyber responses, and regional escalation are not hypotheticals. They are established playbooks. What concerns me most is how military options are used rhetorically. Once leaders publicly reference potential strikes, intelligence agencies are pressured to validate feasibility rather than interrogate necessity. Analysts are asked how to do it, not whether doing it serves any coherent strategic objective. The question of end state, what success actually looks like, is rarely answered. Without that clarity, military action becomes a signal without direction. This is the IRGC targeting trap. It allows policymakers to appear decisive while avoiding the harder admission that they lack a viable strategy for Iran. Intelligence, instead of challenging that gap, is often reduced to enabling language. Risks are acknowledged but normalized. Escalation is discussed but deferred. The result is a pattern where force is used not to achieve defined outcomes, but to sustain narratives of strength. In a multipolar environment, that pattern is unsustainable. Adversaries are not guessing at our intentions, they are watching our behavior. When militarized signals are disconnected from strategy, they communicate confusion, not resolution. Intelligence was meant to prevent that misalignment. Its failure to do so is not accidental. It reflects a system that has learned to prioritize appearance over consequence. What ultimately collapses in moments like this is not a single policy or president, but credibility itself. Strategic credibility is not built on warnings, options, or televised resolve. It is built on consistency between words, intelligence assessments, and action over time. From where I sit, the United States has spent years eroding that foundation by allowing narrative to outrun reality. The Iran episode is not unique. It is simply another data point in a long trend that adversaries have already incorporated into their calculations. In a multipolar world, credibility is comparative. Other powers do not measure American resolve against our own rhetoric. They measure it against our follow through and our tolerance for cost. When red lines are invoked without enforcement, when intelligence is shaped to fit pre existing narratives, and when options are endlessly discussed but rarely resolved, the signal sent is unmistakable. It tells competitors that U.S. decision making is fragmented, domestically constrained, and increasingly performative. That is not a moral judgment, it is an intelligence assessment. What makes this deterioration particularly damaging is that it feeds on itself. Each unfulfilled warning increases the incentive for the next administration to escalate its language to compensate. Each escalation of language widens the gap between rhetoric and capacity. Intelligence agencies are caught in the middle, pressured to provide certainty where none exists and to justify confidence that is not analytically earned. Over time, this corrodes the profession's internal standards and external reputation. Adversaries adapt faster than bureaucracies reform. Iran, like other regional powers, does not need to defeat the United States militarily to advance its interests. It only needs to remain standing, absorb pressure, and exploit inconsistency. When American policy oscillates between sanctions, cyber actions, rhetorical threats, and symbolic strikes, the message is not unpredictability. It is reluctance masked as resolve. In intelligence terms, that is a vulnerability. The collapse of the American strategic narrative did not occur because the country lacked power. It occurred because power was repeatedly exercised without a coherent theory of change, and intelligence was repurposed to defend that incoherence. When intelligence becomes a storytelling device rather than a discipline of restraint, policy loses its anchor to reality. That loss is cumulative. It does not announce itself with a single failure. It reveals itself in how often warnings are issued, how rarely they are enforced, and how little they alter adversary behavior. From my perspective, the lesson is blunt. Until intelligence regains its role as an adversarial check on policy rather than a supporting character in its performance, the erosion will continue. Credibility, once spent, is not easily restored. And in a world no longer organized around American primacy, the cost of that erosion will only grow.